Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this edition of 30 on Thursdays, SusQtech's bi-weekly webinar series. I'll get into some housekeeping here at the beginning before we jump into today's topic. For those of you joining us for the first time, 30 on Thursday, like I said, is a bi-weekly 30-minute webinar series that we've been doing for about 2 years now, where we cover all sorts of topics in and around SharePoint. Our next webinar is going to be the follow-up to this webinar. It's going to be Security and Compliance Part 2, Managing Security and Compliance in SharePoint, and that'll be on Thursday, April 18th. So again, 2 weeks from today. The full schedule, we have the schedule built out now through the end of May, so you can sign up for any of our upcoming webinars going to susqtech.com/webinars. A little bit of housekeeping. Today's session is being recorded, so if you have to duck out early and aren't able to attend the full session, it'll be on our website usually within a day. You can go to susqtech.com/archive-webinars, and you can see not only this session but all the past sessions of 30 on Thursday. And we want today's session to be very interactive, so there is a question window located, typically it's on the right-hand side of your screen, of your monitor, in GoToWebinar. If you fire questions in, as Mario is going through today's presentation, we'll try to make this interactive, and I'll pump in questions as he's covering certain topics, as opposed to saving them to the end like we've done in the past. So again, we want to make this as interactive as possible. Just a quick note on some other online training that we offer. We do paid webinars. We typically do them about once a month on some topics where we deep dive a topic on SharePoint. They're 3 hours in length. But we have all of those recorded and available on our website at susqtech.com/online-classes. And one last bit of information related to more, like I said, more formalized training. Our SharePointConference.org, which is we're heading into our 6th year of organizing this conference. It's going to be at the Gaylord National in June. We are running a promotion. If you sign up for, or if you register by the 12th of April, you'll get a free Kindle Fire HD. Conference has got a great mix of speakers. Topics will be covered from SharePoint 2010, 2013. There's a business track, a designer track, a developer track. So it's a great conference. We have a lot of speakers out there, so look forward to seeing you there. So let's jump into today's session. Again, this is part 1 of a 2-part series. We're calling it Security and Compliance. And today we're going to talk about managing information security and risks. And today our presenter is Mario Balakgie. He's the Security and Privacy Solutions Director at Protiviti. He's got over 24 years of IT security experience, and he's going to bring to us a lot of information about IT security and how it relates to, and eventually we'll get into talking about SharePoint in the follow-up session. I will be your moderator. I'm Steve Witt. I'm the Director of Training and Product here at SusQtech. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and give control over to Mario, and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, yep, Mario, I'm seeing your desktop just fine.
Great, thank you. Let's go ahead and get started then. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone, for joining today on this topic of interest. What I would like to do is to talk to everyone about some information security risks, and particularly from an IT and organizational level, with the understanding of what many of you do, which is manage SharePoint in your particular environment. I think it goes without saying that when you think about all the things you got to do for not only SharePoint, but also from my view for security, I particularly like this quote. It's gotten to the point where organizations who are really involved in anything that has to do with what I call access or connectivity to the internet, you're dealing with security and privacy issues. And it really doesn't matter what kind of organization you are, whether you're federal, whether you're a private institution, a nonprofit, a profit, you name it. You're no doubt subject to some challenges as it pertains to the use of technology when you're connected to the internet. And I say when you're connected, I know everyone is ultimately connected, but really it's the internet that poses the most significant amount of threat to any organization. And you see on the screen there all kinds of examples. I'm sure everyone on the line has heard something somewhere. And it was interesting this morning, or late last night, I saw, at least on the MSN website, yet another widespread denial of service attack against financial institutions. And it was a significant article because it's been an ongoing issue with many of the banks getting what's called denial of service attacks. And it's clear to me when I see things of that, there's a lot going on than what you think. Why is that? Well, I call it the new world order of information, right? Data is becoming more and more prominent in every part of our life. And really, when you think about it, everything is digitized, right? So as a result, when something is digitized, it becomes subject to all kinds of opportunities as well as areas of concern. So you hear a lot about what does it mean when we talk about data security and privacy, and what exactly is happening around us. Well, that's why we see things about data analytics. When I think of data analytics, I think of large extent, volume of information that has tremendous business value, but also you talk about vulnerabilities or what opportunity that brings to a perpetrator or an adversary, then it's pretty big. But when you see these kinds of issues, companies are being subject to these attacks, and there's loss and there's theft, and requirements to report by law. A lot of these things are happening because of privacy concerns and privacy issues. But at the same time, the scale of vulnerabilities are not always understood, right? So when you hear about an issue like the one I just talked about with the banks, and what you don't read is what kind of information was stolen, and if any, and what does that mean if that information stolen is related to, when you think of financial information, first thing that comes up is personal identifiable information. The damage assessment is very difficult. I can tell you, in working in this area for many, many years, the most difficult thing to understand what happened when you discover a particular penetration or a breach or a compromise. And the two difficult things that are always questionable is how long has that person or that breach been successful, and what have they done? It isn't always that they've stolen information. It could be that they have something lying in wait. It could be that they're waiting with some sort of Trojan time bomb or some other objective that they might have. So damage assessment is also very difficult, and it brings a significant set of challenges. Governance and the lack of governance, and I particularly want to bring this up to this group because we're talking about SharePoint and managing data and information. This is a particular area of concern. A lot of companies and organizations were probably stood up very quickly. SharePoint environment or other information and data sharing management were put into place to meet some immediate demand. That is good, but unfortunately, what a lot of time is missing is clear governance around the data, and when that happens, there's an increase in risk. You may be familiar with the term APT, Advanced Persistent Threat. And let me just tell you real quick, what this means is when an adversary targets your organization, they're going to come at you in every way possible, and they're going to be persistent. They are going to try multiple techniques, and you shut down one door, they're going to try another door, and they have become very, very advanced in methods, tools, and techniques. And this is a big concern that you're going to hear about as well continuously. Social engineering, in areas where security technology has improved, meaning that the technology has successfully been able to slow down or maybe completely prevent hack attacks or other kind of attacks, what does a perpetrator do? They use social engineering, right? And you've heard of these, I'm sure, where someone who's trying to get access sets up a fake email or sets up some fake call list or does something to convince an authorized user to hand over some credentials or some privileges. And social engineering continues to be a clear opportunity as well. So with this kind of new world order, what do you have to do? And this is what we're really talking about here. It's all about managing risk. And I wanted to spend just a few minutes on why is this important and what are the real implications of risk management for information. It's really understanding what your risk loss can be or what can happen when certain things fail in your environment. And those failures can be around processes, people, and systems. And that's what really we're talking about when you're looking at trying to understand the risk. The risk of risk is many different things, but some key things here that I wanted to point out, and it really depends on the kind of business that you're involved in, but first and foremost is some sort of risk or some sort of exposure, I should say, may bring to your organization legal implications. If you're dealing with privacy-related or HIPAA-related information or other kinds of information that are governed by laws, you're going to be subject to significant after actions to include potentially fines. A lot of you who are involved in this may already understand what those are. But it goes without saying there are more and more laws being implemented regarding the handling of digitized information that is considered confidential, sensitive, or personal. There's also a loss of credibility. If you're involved and you have in a breach and you have a particular standing in the business community, your credibility and damage to your brand could be affected. And this has happened several times. If you think of like Sony with their recent games that were compromised some time ago, you may have heard about this, but the Sony PlayStation had a hole that was exploited, and that hole resulted in Sony taking some damage to their brand. Consumer or customer confidence. If you're involved in e-commerce, customers may start to wonder whether or not your products or your services come into question. And that's happened several times, as well as business disruption. These are the things that are, as examples, some of the impact in terms of what happens when you're trying to manage risk or what you're trying to avoid. The goals of risk management is simply to understand and to have an acceptable level of risk that is assumed by senior management. And simply stated, this means that an organization understands through a risk evaluation process what exactly are the risk exposure and have taken actions to confirm it and accept it. That's very important because in some cases, a risk assessment may result in some significant actions where the executives who understand and are presented what those actions are may decide for different reasons not to implement all the mitigation, and therefore they are accepting the risk. The controls in providing the kinds of exposure and understanding of the losses within acceptable level of risk is also a significant and important goal of this process. So you put in goals, you understand what those goals are, or excuse me, controls. You are understanding what the exposure and losses are, and here again, you're making a decision that says what is acceptable. And then lastly, the goal of risk is really to take into play some planning activity around what is going to be required to absorb losses associated with the risk to which controls may not necessarily be implemented. So that's at a high level. Those are some of the things that the purpose of risk management entails. Now, there are challenges across the board when we talk about data and security privacy. And I'm not going to go through this entire list, but in this presentation will be shared with everyone. But really, the increased concern is around information leakage and what that means in terms of trying to bring issues or bring significant aspects of data risk management into focus. And you can see like some of the questions in there. Where is your data stored? How is it transmitted? How are you doing compliance? What is your level of awareness and education around those controls? And what are the requirements around third party? All these things continue to become significant issues and challenges around security and privacy. So why does this happen? Who's to blame? Okay? And what this chart really is trying to show is the problem is both internal and external when it comes to IT and management of information. And you can see the trend there as it goes up. It's become almost slightly 50-50 share. And what this is saying, internal are those things that are internal to your environment, whereas external are those things where when you send data that you don't control how third party manages and handles your data. So the trend here also is that the cost of the breaches continues to increase significantly, and this will not be a surprise to anyone. Lastly, there's a growing regulatory compliance requirements. You can see this trend as well across the spectrum, and I hear about compliance requirements all the time coming through the government, but it goes without saying, and again, a lot of you might be in a business where you are totally familiar with some of your compliance challenges and what legal implications there are. So let's talk about how you get to provide information security risk assessment. First of all, you got to have a plan, and then you got to execute, and you got to monitor. When we talk about a plan, we're talking about a stated and formally accepted plan around information risk management to which all stakeholders, and here again the leadership, the C-suite executives, and all others who are involved and actually endorse and take active participation. So this is not just a CIO level, this is across the leadership role. The execution part means that you got to select a process to do risk management framework. And I'll get into that a little bit. And you got to ensure that you're doing a comprehensive approach that really encompasses your entire environment. Once you go through this process, then you got to monitor, right? It's like anything. If the results are not taken serious, then really it's an effort for none. You have to identify ownership. You've got to manage the requirements around mitigation, and you got to continue to report on how well you're doing as part of the monitoring process. So for risk assessment, and particularly around IT, there should be some stated goals. And those are, as you see on this, really is to get a view of what is happening in your IT environment and to manage that environment as it relates to your risk. It also means understanding how the investments of internal controls already in place can promote the idea of managing and conducting a risk assessment. It's also important to use a common language to manage those activities and promote the whole idea of risk ownership. So just quickly, when you hear security and privacy, I felt that this would be good for at least this group to kind of get a sense. Security is the protection of the assets, and it's usually around something called confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And there are a number of standards out there. You can see what those are. You might have heard of some of them. But certainly ISO is a commercial, NIST is a government, and COBIT is another commercial version of some of the models. Privacy is protecting confidential information around private data. And again, think of personal information and confidential information. And there's a model for that as well. But the entire spectrum of security and privacy entails these things from A through M. And I'm sure that you've heard of a lot of these things, but really, when we talk about an enterprise-wide comprehensive view of security and privacy, we're talking about looking across these multiple aspects of an IT organization. So what I want to do in the next few slides is give you an example of what a risk assessment entails. I told you a little bit about various risk frameworks, and I'm going to go through for this group, because you're probably mostly commercial, I'm going to give you the ISO version, which is 27001 is the particular framework that is applied across the commercial industry and to some degree internationally. What you see there on the slide is all the various areas that are assessed as part of this risk management framework. And by the way, when you look at this ISO standard, and you look at maybe a government NIST standards, they're about 90% similar. The 10% is the uniqueness might be from a government versus a commercial viewpoint. So this is what a risk framework looks like, and these are the areas that would be assessed. But before we go any further, what I really want to talk to this group about is the whole concept of data sensitivity. And this is important because this drives the kind of review and the kind of data governance and categorization that every organization should be thinking about. And I felt it was important for this group, being that you're involved in the management and sharing our information and collaboration, that we spend just a brief minute on this. What you see here is a typical environment that we have seen across the client base. And at the top of the pyramid is that information which most organizations consider the most important, the most critical part of their environment. It's usually around 5 to 10%, and it's considered high value. Why? Because it's sensitive and very critical. When it's compromised, there's a major impact to the organization, and there's a need to protect it at the highest cost. Secondly, coming down from that, in the middle, this is where most organizations have a lot of their information. It's considered medium value, 80 to 90%. This is where most of you do your work, right? The impact of that information, if compromised, has some significance, but not as much as high value, and this is where your highest volume of data resides. Then there's the low value information, or data sensitivity, and I usually tell people, think of this as something that if it's lost, it means almost nothing to you and it's completely replaceable. A bus schedule is a good example of that. Now, a lot of organizations, when we typically come in and do an assessment, they say everything is important to us. And I would say probably not. Because if everything is important, everything can't be up at the top. And those things that ride at the very top of this triangle are, in order to meet this high value protection, it means that you're going to spend the most amount of resources to meet that goal. So clearly, and when you look at this information and data sensitivity hierarchy, you want to think of your environment, because once you categorize your data, information that's high value is going to be designed in an environment that provides the greatest amount of protection, more than the medium value. And the low value is things that you put on your public-facing site. So this is an important thing to keep in mind when you think of data sensitivity. So next, I want to touch on a few slides about what exactly is risk assessment. And I'm going to move through these fairly quickly. And like I said, we'll provide the information, but I just want to talk you through the process. So the first thing you do is, in a risk assessment process, is if you look at on the left there, you identify your assets and you go through a process where you assess the threat, the vulnerabilities, you do a risk determination, identify safeguards, you report it, and then you have a remediation plan. Once you start in this process, then it takes you to the next phase, which is this risk analysis activity. And you could see under each one of these, there are a series of activities that would be involved in achieving this analysis. And again, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but I will, certainly you can look at this at your leisure. But the important thing is you're going to go through this process, and you're going to come up with some deliverables, and these deliverables are going to tell you very specific outcomes in each area. And these outcomes then are going to be mapped against a series of metrics, and these are the metrics. Again, this is for information, but fundamentally, when you go through this process of calculating your risk, you're evaluating your asset, you're looking at the severity of the impact, the likelihood of occurrence, etc., you're going to come up with a residual risk. Ultimately, what you're going to see then, as a result of this, is the following. What this says, as part of the risk process, is you've got, in the example here, 1 through 11 areas that have been assessed, and the result is there's some risk impact related to these 11 areas. And what the heat, excuse me, what the heat map shows you is recommended categorizations of low, medium, or high. Obviously, something that's low, you're not going to worry about it. As something that's medium and something that's high means you need to address this right away because the risks are very high to you. So I'm going to stop there. I went through this rather quickly, and I want to give the give everyone a chance to ask some questions. So please, any questions, any comments, or thoughts on what you heard so far?
Okay, great. Thanks, Mario. We do have a bunch of questions or a bunch of people asking about the availability of the PowerPoint being available after the presentation.
Right after this, I'll give it to you and you can send it out to everyone.
Great. So before we get into some questions, I mean, I guess I had a question. What do you think, you know, in your experience, where is the most common mistake made when handling risk and doing the assessment? Is it spending too much effort on stuff that falls in that kind of that medium impact because it's that approach of everything is important, so we have to protect everything, or is it kind of, what do you see as to be the most common mistake when dealing with managing risk?
The biggest challenge that we see organizations is they haven't really linked their business imperatives into the IT management and security. In other words, there might be a disconnect between what information technology organization thinks is a priority and what in terms of security and protection versus what the business needs are. Once you have a true connection between the two, then you could really start to understand what is the important thing that we need to do as part of this assessment. And I'll give you 2 quick examples. If you're an organization that's involved in e-commerce, then your business imperatives are making sure that your website is up and your services are available to sell your services. That's a different kind of security layer and protection versus someone that is maybe involved in healthcare. If you're involved in healthcare, the predominance of your security requirements are around privacy. So it's really understanding what your business imperatives are and bringing focus on an assessment in that area.
Gotcha. So a lot of times when the risk assessment is done, it's done from an IT perspective as opposed to from the overall business?
Correct. Correct. And in many places, what organizations don't realize is where their vulnerabilities are because they haven't done a holistic view. They may be looking at one area when, in fact, you may be really good at, let's say, your environment may be really good at maintaining and updating your antivirus software. But meanwhile, your servers have known exploits that a perpetrator can easily take advantage of and come into your environment and gain privileged access without you really knowing it. So that is a potential disconnect that we see all the time.
Gotcha. Yeah, and a follow-up question that somebody wrote in as you're kind of walking through that e-commerce example is, are the threats different? I mean, are we talking about internal threats, external threats, or kind of both?
It certainly both need to be considered, but I want to add one comment here. There is an internal threat that also a lot of companies are worried about, meaning internal from the standpoint of users who have authorized access and what opportunity that presents itself to a potential disgruntled employee. So there are some internal threats that are not necessarily the same as external. But when you're looking at threats across the board, you want to look at it from both viewpoints. And a lot of organizations will bring us in to do an internal and an external assessment.
Gotcha. Okay. I think that's all the questions. I'll give it another couple seconds here. And Mario, while I'm waiting to see if there's any more questions, do you have a slide with maybe some contact information? If
Sure, I do. I wanted to, touch on, I think we already touched on this, the summary is, there's a purpose for risk management, and I would tell anyone the following. You really need to understand what risks you are faced with, and only then should you make investments into areas of security and improving your technology environment. And know when you should measure it, and what are the areas that you want to measure, and use the risk assessment to drive what you're trying to do. So in terms of contacts, there it is right there. I'll leave that slide up. And the presentation, copy of this presentation will follow immediately.
Okay, great. And I had another question. I'm going to maybe have to try to paraphrase it because I don't know that I quite understand it, Mario. Can companies pay too much attention to the internal threat?
Yes, they sure can. I think that there are ways to really understand what is it that you're trying to protect from an internal view, and understand that there are things that you would want to do and there are things that you want to spend resources on. I have seen in some places where companies and organizations, through some level of paranoia, are probably doing too much on the internal side, and when they're being exposed more against external threats. I think it goes back to what are the objectives? What are you trying to protect from the internal source? I will say this, just to add to that comment. The one internal threat that I think certainly warrants attention is that of those individuals that have privileged access. Privileged access in this case could mean administrators that have keys to the kingdom, if you will, or other individuals that have escalated accesses to do some sort of business function. I think those are a small subset of the workforce, but those are individuals that I would say you want to put some program in place to pay attention to.
Very good. And then a follow-up, this is the second part of that question, talking about, can you pay too much attention to an internal threat? Almost to the point where if you spend too much time and maybe overly restrict or do too much, that you can actually, it can, for lack of a better word, I'm paraphrasing here, backfire and maybe create some ill will.
Yes, absolutely. I think that I've seen evidence of that in certain client environments, and I think that when that exists, then there needs to be a reevaluation of what management's views are and why they're exercising an overwhelming amount of precaution. But it's like anything else. It has to be a balanced approach. It's got to be thought through in terms of the objectives. What is the concern? Why is it a concern? What's the business implication of the internal threat? And there are many different things you could do with it. And again, it goes back to how much you want to spend on this. Why, is it at the top of the pyramid, or is it down at the lower level? Not everything is at the top.
Exactly. Okay, well, I think that does it for the questions, and we're about 5 minutes after the hour. Mario, I'd like to thank you for your time. This was great, and to everybody out there, this was part one, and this is going to be a two-part series. So we're going to take the concepts that Mario has laid out for us here in part one. And part two, which is 2 weeks from today, we're going to get into some of the things you can do in SharePoint to make it more secure, and look at some maybe vulnerable spots and some things you can do to help manage and keep your SharePoint environment compliant and safe. So again, Mario, thank you for your time this afternoon, and we'll see everybody in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
The organizer has ended the session, and this call will be disconnected. Goodbye.